I think the real answer to that question is this project actually found me, as projects often do. So I was trawling the archives in Venice looking for wills that related to one of the women writers I was really interested in the earlier project. And I happened to get the wrong box of materials one day. I don't know if I'd made an error or if the archivist made an error, but it was late in the day and I couldn't order anything more. So I had this giant box of final testaments from the late 16th century, so right era for the person I was looking for, but my person was not there. And I just thought, well, my graduate advisor had given me some really excellent advice back in the day, along with many advice. He said to me, if you can't read the one you want, read the one you're with. Italian archives are slow moving, so take what you got. So I ended up reading through this huge stack of wills. I mean, they're giant boxes, and there are probably, depends on the length, but between, let's say, 150 and 200 in a box. And I ran across this one that was hugely atypical. I mean, normally a final testament in late 16th century Venice is a page affair, regardless if it's someone who's wealthy or not wealthy, a noble or an artisan or a laborer. They'll say, I leave my soul to God, I leave my property to my principal heir, and I maybe leave a little bit of what I've got, if anything, to charity. What I found instead with this one will was something that is 8 single-space typed pages in a modern transcript. And what it was the will of a man called Francesco Longo, who was a physician. And he was just desperate to be remembered as a humanist. He gives these lengthy philosophical ruminations. He cites Plutarch. He refers to the ancient Persian king Artaxerxes. And instead of charitable bequests, he left to his heirs, 3 sons and his daughter, a wonderful series of what scholars would call ethical bequests, which are little maxims or aphorisms often drawn from classical antiquity, also from the Christian canon, to sort of encourage and shape their lives and hopefully inspire them to be virtuous in all sorts of different ways, both Christian and kind of classical in their resonances. So my question was, how do I understand this man? This is so unusual. I mean, he's paying a notary, because he was very ill. He was paying a notary to write all of this down, and as the document goes on, you begin to see the notary's hand cramp. And you can just imagine him saying, excuse me, sir, like, this is a final testament, okay, but maybe you don't need to exploit the potential of testament as much as you're doing. But he continued to do that, and so my quest for the next couple of years was to try to see, did anybody else take this approach to a will? What was it that he so needed from posterity? Because he already had his university degrees. He needed a Bachelor of Arts as well as a medical degree to call yourself a physician, which he did. Why was that not enough, culturally speaking? What was he trying to say to his own time, to his heirs, and to the future about who he was and what he really valued? So I sort of took bits and pieces of this will and just began reading archival documents as fast as I could find them. I ended up reading over 3,000 testaments and over 1,200 household inventories, looking for other people who seem to have had these literary, philosophical kinds of priorities. Dr. Longo also mentioned his Latin, Italian, and Greek books in his testament as well. So I had both the kind of philosophical signals I was looking for, and also just people who owned books. So that's how the project found me, and it ended up being a really interesting deep dive into the archives. Yeah, that is the question that actually keeps me up at night, because historians, I mean, one of our greatest sports is trying to find out these sort of social boundaries and talk about them responsibly. And for, the entirety of my career to date, what is elite and what is non-elite has plagued me. And I think that really since the late 80s, there's been a lot of work in many different domains, well beyond Renaissance studies, in thinking about really putting a question mark between our usual boundaries, high culture, low culture, elite, non-elite. But the degree to which we do that successfully remains open for debate. So on the one hand, I could say, yes, all of my 3 central case studies, are elite in the sense that they were not starving, they had access to education, and their profession situated them, let's say, in the, to be a little anachronistic about it, upper middle class. These men, however, were not noble. They were not, therefore, politically enfranchised, because that's the way it worked in Venice in the 16th century, really for the whole early modern period. Unless you were a member of the urban nobility, the patriciate, you had no say in governance. You had no vote. You had no sort of access politically in that sense, formally. So they were, again, in a kind of nebulous zone between, let's say, that 80% or more of everyday, really everyday people who were perhaps starving to death or living at subsistence, which is true across Europe and really across the early modern world. So they weren't in that 80%. They were maybe in this 20% zone that had lots of possibility. But they didn't have that very upper tier level of absolute enfranchisement. And what's interesting about the physicians is the way they both still feel the weight of their backgrounds. Most of them, in fact, had artisanal parents, pharmacists or merchants. So they still belonged to the everyday working folk in terms of their social backgrounds, even if they had these nice fancy university degrees. So they were in a fascinatingly awkward space between the robustly enfranchised and the absolutely disenfranchised. So they are, in that sense, yes and no, elite and not. But the other thing that I found so interesting about these physicians is the degree to which they reflect on their lack of all of the credentials one might want to have for real cultural legitimacy. This is the framing concept of the whole book, right? What Dr. Longo wanted initially, and then what so many of my other protagonists seem to be striving for in proving themselves people of letters. That was the really important thing in this era. That showed that you were a member of the right sort. They have this wonderful phrase that kept coming back into these testaments I was reading in the time. They would say, that someone who really had it was a uomo da bene, which could be translated an honest man, a good businessman, but also a person of the right sort. And that kind of literary credential, educational credentials, caring about books, cultural legitimacy was what so many people from so many different walks of life, but especially my physicians, seem to be striving to prove. So in a sense, I'm, of course, deeply influenced by the theorist Pierre Bourdieu, who talked about distinction in modern contexts above all, but also early modern. Distinction, having good taste, these kinds of things as tools, as a kind of cultural capital that people might actually manage to parley or translate into literal capital in some form. What I thought was so interesting, though, about many of my people, and my physicians especially, is some of them were absolutely determined to get social, financial advantage out of their educations. But many others weren't, like my Dr. Longo. It was important for him to belong to the people of the right sort, the people who knew about antiquity, the people who read their classics, even if they sometimes misread them, as Longo did every once in a while. It was important to them to say, I have mastered, this tradition, and I think it's valuable, and I think it makes me more virtuous, and it helps me understand my world in some sense. And so there are lots of different ways we could think about cultural legitimacy beyond just cultural capital and its conversion into social or financial capital. But again, I think these are just ways of asking similar but also perhaps more interesting, more nuanced questions about what is elite, who really belongs, who gets to play with the cool kids, whoever they are. And in this era, humanists or humanistic learning sort of defined the boundaries of who was in and who was out, who was a person of the right sort and who wasn't. So a number of bits of evidence surprised and troubled me. I'll talk about the surprise first. I was surprised in a sense to find that there weren't quite so many people like Dr. Longo as I had hoped. I am a cultural optimist, I guess I would say. And what I ultimately found out of reading all those thousands and thousands of archival documents, and of course triangulating them with print matter of various kinds, was that on average, let's say 18% or so of the household inventories I looked at really had some evidence for a person or family who had collected literature specifically. I mean, I screened out all of the cases of maybe just having a prayer book or two, which is interesting in its own right, and scholars do wonderful work on what, the reading of prayer books means and kind of interactions with prayer books means. I was really looking for humanistic collections of some kind. So 5 books that were literature. Sometimes assessors would just say books for reading or letters or something like this. Sometimes they would give us titles, more rarely. So I had to sort of screen the sample that way in some sense. But 18% or so of the folks managed to, demonstrate that they had committed. And sometimes if it's an artisanal or a mercantile family, buying 5 books was a lot of resources for the family. So this was a passionate commitment, even if it wasn't a huge library. I had hoped to maybe find a bit more, because that number actually maps onto what Albert Labarre and others working on book history and other cultural contexts seem to find. In other words, the people whose inventories reveal some literary collecting tend to be about 18% of the group, which is interesting. The other thing about that, though, and this gets me back to the everyday people, is that what is ultimately most important about those kinds of numbers is not the sheer numerical value, but the range of people it represents. So within that, let's say 18% of folks who really invested in some way I could see in humanistic collecting, there were perfumers, apothecaries, retail merchants, wine merchants, wives of men in that category. Sometimes there's one of my favorite, surprising in the positive sense, cases was a goldsmith's wife who had this little miniature humanistic library. Everything was in translation. She couldn't read Latin, and maybe she couldn't read these books either, but she had preserved a little collection of books that had in it Lucan, Josephus, really the greatest hits of antiquity, as well as contemporary humanist letters. So, again, it's this kind of broad social diversity in that category that when we look a little bit closer, we begin to find. So even if I was secretly, let's say, in my heart of hearts, hoping to find a boatman, reading ancient Greek, I haven't found him yet, but I may. I didn't, not in this group, but at the very least, what I did see and was surprised by in a different way was the breadth of the social diversity of people who engaged with the book at some level. This is not something that historians haven't thought about, but I think going at it through these sources actually helps us. Not just the book inventories, but I think also especially the testaments. One of the things that I also found surprising, even though there weren't a lot of Dr. Longos, using their final wills as a space to leave a literary monument for themselves. That was more like 2% of the total number of wills I read. But all the same, it showed the similar diversity and also signaled a reality that we haven't been able to substantiate particularly well to this point. We know that humanistic learning appealed to a wider variety of people than just the most famous authors. It had to have done, or it wouldn't have survived. But on the other hand, who were they? How can we get a little bit more access to them? So one of the things I found surprising, again in the positive sense, even if numerically a little disappointing, was the fact that you have merchants leaving these long descriptions in their final testaments about what kind of education they want for their illegitimate son that's going to save them, right, from this social blemish, that's going to catapult them forward socially, culturally, in other ways, hopefully financially as well. Many of these parents, perhaps like parents today, are very concerned about the earning power of their children. And they see education as the answer, as the key to these things. So what I actually found, rather than a sort of feel-good story about what education does for you, it is that too, was also a way of opening up a lot of anxieties that I think resonate with us now about what makes not just a good person, what makes an effective person, what makes an ethical person. How do you educate someone to both make some money and also have an honorable posterity? So these kinds of tense reflections that especially parents go through in wills is a fascinating, I think, treasure that came out of all of that digging. Well, one of my questions has to do with place. Venice is, in some respects, atypical. The book focuses on the city itself, though some of its mainland territories come into the story at various points. I wonder about university towns in particular. I mean, I love Venice, as you know, and as many of us do, but even the most robust collections I found among Venetians collections of books, especially in these household inventories, pale by comparison to the kinds of collections of books, art, music, musical instruments that I've seen scholars find in other places. In Padua, for example, above all. I mean, some of those collections, even within the Veneto itself, as we get close to the big university town of Padua, are just phenomenal and on a scale completely different than my grubby urban collectors. So I wonder in the future what would happen if we paid more attention to university towns, because if the big idea of this book is the notion of cultural legitimacy as a tool for people to reshape their lives or to help their children, all sorts of things, would it not perhaps show itself even more clearly in the kinds of social and geographic spaces that are specifically designed to deal with education at every level of society? So, university towns, and then all of the aspects of culture that support a university. Print shops and bookshops and scribes and all of these kinds of things that cluster around a university. I'm suddenly wondering if I went, ransacking in the scholarly way, not literally, ransacking the archives in other places, in Padua, in Bologna, in, for that matter, Oxford. I mean, I think comparative work looking at university towns might be a next step in this to find more folks like my people. Okay, I would like that to be another physician, the third of my case studies, placed last for a reason, named Alberto Rini. He blew my mind. First of all, let me set up how I found him, or really how he found me, through friends. There are a couple of musicologists who were also working in the Venetian archives when I was doing my initial research for this book, and they had come across the account books of Dr. Rini, and they found that they were not particularly useful for the questions they were asking about musical culture, but they knew I was working on sort of humanists hiding in the archives. And they said, I think this might be something for you to look at. And so I took a look. Dr. Rini's account books showed everyday expenses, little details of his life, as you might imagine, for basically his check registers of the day, accounts of what he'd been buying and the people he'd been paying, and sometimes people he'd loaned books to and he wanted to be sure he got them back, all of this kind of thing. But what was most beautiful to find, cramped, I mean, we're talking about these narrow ledgers, right? In these tiny margins, he is scrawling little civic histories, little bits of family history, notes of things that were interesting to him, contacts he'd made among lettered people, especially the humanist Paolo Ramuzio. It's incredibly moving to see someone recording for posterity very clearly. I mean, he calls these notes per memoria, which is just, for remembrance, but he includes things in there that he would not have needed for his own remembrance, in the sense that every time he talks about his brother Scipione, he calls him my brother. Well, he's not probably going to forget this. And so he's leaving this in some sense for whatever that audience is we imagine when we're trying to record something important about our lives, who we were, what we've seen, what we thought about what we saw. He was an obsessive reader, as I could see from his household inventory, which I also found, obsessive collector of books and other things. But he also learned from them. I mean, he loved reading chronicles and the ways in which he records little events in his civic life right there in Venice really echo his reading. He finds at one moment room, again, even in these tiny spaces, to record a fire that had threatened the ducal palace. And he talks about the conflagration and the different parts of the city that came together to save the ducal palace. And the way in which he describes this really follows all of the conventions of classical and contemporary, for him, humanist writing about, the leadership of the nobility, but also the courage and fortitude and just, sweat and labor of everyday people in tamping out the fire. But probably the most beautiful thing in all of that description was the way, again, he signals his cultural priorities more than anything else. And as he's describing the fire and the architectural ornamentation that it destroyed in the ducal palace, he also mentions that paintings by Bellini and Titian were lost. And the way in which he words this makes it so clear that he's grieving as a connoisseur of art. He says, not just these balustrades and all this wonderful architecture burned by the fire, with them, these insieme, these wonderful works. He couldn't afford a Bellini or a Titian. He didn't even own his own home. He rented. But he wanted his experience as being a Venetian, someone who appreciated art, someone who knew about art even. He wanted that on record. Something very similar, too, when he records deaths of doges and things, as he does, as a good chronicler would do. He, talks about the moment at which this important figure in Venetian civic life passed on. He mentions probably the cause of death, maybe that bit of his physician self creeping in there, his professional deformity, we might call it. The cause of death was always important for him. But then he'll also talk about the orator who gave the funerary oration, often a humanist, someone he would have looked up to as a reader, and little details like this. But one of the things I found absolutely the most gorgeous was that he describes the death of his family dog in the same way, using the same conventions of the chronicle. He talks, at one moment we see this beautiful little entry. It's like, our dog Satin died today at 4:00 in the afternoon. We buried him by the topiary of jasmine in the garden, and Marina, our maid, gave a eulogy. It's just, the degree to which he could find, even in real tragedy, even in terror, something about his literary background gave him some really important tools for thinking about his own importance. Who cared about Dr. Rini? Well, he thought posterity might somehow, that he had seen something that might be of interest, and he wanted that on record. This is also one of the things I found surprising, as I've given talks on the book and, people have read parts of it. Some do take people like Rini or Longo as a bit pompous, but I don't read them that way, in the sense that we can see them, in a sense, sweating to live up to some ideals that did not come to them as their birthright. These were not patrician men. And so it's partly just, I think, when we read these sorts of lengthy excurses, or this sort of reaching, this kind of literary reaching to describe your own life, in our cultural context, that means, you're being snobby, you're being pompous, you're maybe even overstepping your social place somehow. But at their time, that was, they're kind of butting their heads up against, let's call it a marble ceiling of, again, back to this question of elites and non-elites, and the ways in which they strive to be part of this literary culture, I find really moving. In a sense, it's almost the opposite of pomposity, because they know that this is something that people might not deny them, but at the very least kind of look at them askance. It's like, do you really belong to the educated crowd? Do you really belong to the people of the right sort? There are all kinds of suspicions along those lines, if you didn't happen to have the pedigree and the wealth and everything else. So, that... But one can read it, and I think that's going to be, I hope, that people will read the book, and then if and when they do, that this will be something we can talk about, that, I read these people because I am attached to them. I love my dead people. I read them as very charming in their striving. But one could also read them as overreachers, or as attempting to put forth an image that's so carefully crafted, in some sense, that we should push back maybe a bit more than I do, and as we analyze it. Well, they do, and I hope people will see the relevance and see the ways in which we wrestle with some of the same problems. But then also think about, again, just as we're talking right now, what the differences might be between our cultural context and theirs. We now have the expectation, in a sense, the degree inflation, that everybody should have a college degree, regardless of what. And I think there are good reasons for saying that. The folks I'm studying are just on the cusp of that sense of the democratization of knowledge. And they're both beneficiaries of it, but then also constrained by the limitations of that vision in their own time. Humanists had, from the 14th century onward, been talking about education as the bedrock of virtue and ethics and wisdom and all of the things you want, obviously in conjunction with Christian ethics and morality. But the degree to which they had come up with any workable plans for ensuring that everybody had access to that education, or the degree to which it was even a concern for them that everyone have it, is a real question mark. I think in some places there were very committed educators who had that kind of notion in their minds, both clerical and lay, as teaching grammar school, teaching in the cathedral schools, teaching in schools of Christian doctrine, Jesuits, underemployed humanists of all kinds, who may have thought, as we do, about access to education. But they're getting back to your point, though, about snobbery and snob appeal and clubbishness. There was some of that too, and there was also a kind of axis of argument that said, well, no, this is actually something that should be held by the right sort of people. Again, we're back to the multiple meanings of that phrase. Does people of the right sort invite, or does it exclude? Those are the kinds of questions that I hope we'll keep wrestling with in our own time, but also in the context of the Renaissance.